I was very much counting on the cloudiness and the rain tonight not needing to put up that curtain, because I just didn't get to it today. And then I probably had a good hour that I could have devoted to it, and I looked at it and said, no, I want to get started on my PowerPoints for Sunday school in Hosea and finishing those up. So I'm very glad that at least silver lining of the rain clouds and the rain that's about to start moving in, that the sun is not in anybody's eyes. Now, as we're in 6:9 through 7:5, when we finish up this what to expect while you're expecting judgment, we talked about that the flood narratives of Genesis 6 through 9 as a whole, what we see is that God is justly judging humanity's corruption that resulted from the second rebellion, the sons of God shacking up with daughters of men, creating the Nephilim giants and creating just the worst society. Nothing but power, dominance, and violence everywhere. If you read pretty much any of the ancient Mesopotamian accounts of this, you know that it was just completely anti-God. So God is going to justly judge them. However, in keeping with his promises before the second rebellion, he is graciously going to preserve the remnant through the bloodline of the seed, which has come down through Adam to the 10th generation of Noah. And he's going to work to do what he's been doing since Genesis 3, restore Eden on earth. This is the story that we're tracking here. So, see, I'm a little out of order here. I don't need any of this. So let's just jump into reading the text again, and then we'll pick up where we left off with, I think, the animals boarding the ark. So this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So, this is the Toledot. This is the account of one of the 10 structuring features of Genesis. Genesis is always counting to 10 or 7 or multiples of 10 and 7 as we get to the Table of Nations in chapter 10. It will be 70 nations. We learned 3 things about Noah. He's a righteous man, blameless among his time, which is, and he walks faithfully with God, which is a comparison to Enoch. So he says, the best man that's walked the earth since Enoch. And God took Enoch without, presumably, him facing death. And now we learn that he has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So that's what we learned about Noah last week. Now we learned about the earth. The earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. This is the world that Nephilim giants make. This is the world that the sons of God and the daughters of men have created. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people of the earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, which is about a football field and a half in length. 50 cubits wide, which is roughly half the width of a football field. 30 cubits high, which is 75 feet-ish. Make a roof for it. No, 45 feet. 45 feet. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. That's about 18 inches. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. So this is the first time he mentions floodwater. So he's talked about judgment. He's threatened it in the prologue in the first 8 verses. Now is the first time we get an actual mention of floodwaters. And we want to move on and talk about what this actually means to the ancient Hebrews' mind tonight. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. Now, again, earth and land are interchangeable in English and in Hebrew. I would hesitate to say everything on land will perish, because mostly because when we think of earth, we're thinking of a globe. And as we took time to talk about ancient Near Eastern cosmology, they don't have a concept of a globe. So I would probably hesitate to translate this earth and just translate it, everything on the land will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you. First mention of covenant in the Bible. You will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You will bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. We'll talk about a little bit about these classifications. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away for food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made." And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Now we left off kind of right here around verse 18 last week. "I will establish my covenant with you." Again, the first mention of a covenant in the Bible. A covenant is just a fancy term for a legally binding contract between 2 or more parties. There's nothing really fancy or all that technical about the term. It's like a treaty. It's a legally binding contract, however you want to discern that. It was usually public because it was a part of communal records, because it was between more than one person. And so on some level, all of the covenants you will find in the Bible are going to be public in nature. Sometimes when people read stuff like God's covenant with Abraham, they don't think other people are there when God's making the covenant. I don't think it would make that much sense if God wasn't actually doing this in front of other people. I think that would be the expectation. And this covenant is between God and all creation, but we'll get to that after the flood narratives. So he's foretelling that he's going to make a covenant even before judgment. So when we talk about stuff about God's mercy, especially in the Old Testament, this idea that God is a God of wrath in the Old Testament and there's no mercy here, that's just dumb. Because even though he goes through judgment, he even before he does the judgment, he says, "I'm actually going to be merciful to creation in all of this. I'm going to recreate things through you, Noah. Therefore, all of you get in the ark, 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to be kept alive." So let's break this down a little bit. 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal in verse 20, and just the general phrasing, every kind of animal, would just probably could be broken down: domesticated and undomesticated. If you have to go out and catch the wild ones, go out and catch the wild ones if you have to. So it's a way of classifying mammals, the way that we define mammals in our modern thinking. In Genesis 1:25, it gives it the designation wild animals and livestock, 2 halves of the same group, every kind of animal here. Because it goes on and it says every kind of creature that moves along the ground, and that's their way of classifying basically reptiles and insects. And in 1:25 of Genesis, it's a single classification as well. So Genesis 1 is using slightly different, even broader language here. But you're not supposed to get bogged down in verse 20 with what are the classifications? How are they thinking of these animals and all of their different types? So although a slightly different grouping from how the animals are represented in Genesis 1, birds, all the land animals, all the reptiles and insects, all of this together, literarily speaking, creates a 3-tiered classification to imply all living creatures known in the ancient Near Eastern, to an ancient Near Eastern Hebrew. You don't need to read the term every creature as every type of creature that exists. It would be much more accurate to say everyone that you know and know about. Everyone that an ancient Mediterranean person would be familiar with. I don't think the Tasmanian devil of Australia is included in this list because nobody in the ancient Mediterranean world would have understood what a Tasmanian devil is. So when people are talking about classifications and they use modern scientific classifications, they're probably going way too far in the wrong direction. This is just all the birds, all your mammals, and all your reptiles and insects and stuff. And you can think of that the story is just telling you 3 broad points to imply a lot more. But also you don't want to push the language so far that it means every creature that existed throughout the whole planet. Because again, they don't have a concept of what a planet is. How many animals is this? What are the exact classifications? I don't know. Nobody really knows because we don't know what records they kept to classify things back then. I'm betting that it's a good handful, enough that it was going to fill a football field and a half of the ark sized with 3 tiers on it, and that's as much as I'm willing to push it. Of course, verse 21, don't forget to bring food to feed them all. And verse 21, there's nothing complicated about it. It's like, don't just make room for them, don't just make shelter for them, don't just go out and collect them. Be sure that they actually have enough to eat and survive. And verse 22, Noah did everything as God commanded him. Noah is likely putting in a lot of hard work into building this. He's got the aid of his 3 sons. I'm not against the idea that he actually hires people to help him out, and that this is still going to take years, maybe decades, depending on how many hired hands he could have had. Even if they thought he was crazy, if he's willing to pay, people will build all sorts of stuff. Humanity's not that different. So build a giant ark, collect or capture and care for the animals until the flood comes. One phrase in Genesis 6 says the animals will come to you to survive. So a lot of portrayals of it have, the flood's about to happen, the ark's ready to go, and all the animals just kind of show up or they march in there. That's taking it a bit more literally. The idea doesn't need to be pushed so specifically to say you won't have to go out and actually get them. They'll come to you. That may be overstating things from that one verse where people always take it. So they may have actually had to go out, collect or capture a male and female of especially the undomesticated mammals and stuff, reptiles and insects. We don't know. I'm just saying that's an option. And while they're building it, they're still growing and gathering food for all of these things. So they're not just building the ark. They're building an ark, collecting all the animals one way or another, and farming to keep them all alive. This is a massive economic project, and who knows how long it took to actually take place, because verse 2 is ultimately designed to just summarize and skip ahead. Noah did everything in the verses from verse 9 through verse 21 following the exact instructions. He led his family to do it, the 7 people that were with him on the ark, so 8 people in total, and let's not get bogged down with the extent of the animal population. It was extensive, that's all we can say. Let's not get bogged down with how long did this take. It took a long time. There's no need to put an exact number on it. We don't know. So verse 22 sums up and said, Noah got it done, one way or another, no matter how long it took. So we'll move on from that. But let me stop. Any questions there? See, that I have mentioned before that I think when God said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for they are mortal, his years will be 120, that God is putting a 120-year time limit or 3 generations of time limit, because 120 years is a literary device for 3 generations. A generation is 40 years in Hebrew time span. So, right. So, I would say, he's got upwards of 100 years, 120 years that he could be spending on this. Yeah, and I see no reason why it's not taking that whole time frame here. So then you've got the first 5 verses of chapter 7. It's the last instructions that God gives before the flood begins, and this is bracketed out differently for the instructions that God has already given. He's already given instructions about building the ark, filling it with animals and food. So why does he come back here and give a separate pair of instructions? This is a question worth asking, and we'll look at the structure of the passage here in a second to help fill it in, what's being communicated and how it's being communicated. So you get the last 7 days. Go into the ark. It's about to rain. And in that you get the last mention of 7 pairs of clean animals. So you get 2 groupings of 7 that occur here. 7 groups of clean animals. Clean animals are just animals that were used by Hebrews for sacrifice. That's it. Unclean animals are any animals that's not used by the Hebrews for sacrifice. So here you're reading clean and unclean more as authorized or unauthorized. This has nothing to do with, does God like them? Does this have nothing to do with, are they morally pure? Is sin involved? Nothing like that. There are no health concerns here. This is being written by Hebrews for Hebrews, and the term clean animals is just a way of saying anything that you guys would know is valid for sacrifice at the temple. That's the point. So there's nothing fancy about the term. In fact, it's so simple that it's very easy to overlook it. So these first 3 verses, God says, go into the ark, you and your wife and your sons and your sons' wives. And that's when he says in verses 2 and 3, 7 pairs of every clean animal for sacrificing, 1 pair of every unclean animal, and then 7 pairs of every bird. And the bird one is not clear, is it for sacrifices or not? Because you could sacrifice birds. They were the cheapest animal for sacrifice, and so the poorest economically would sacrifice birds, not sheep or goats. Bulls and oxen were the most expensive, so the richer upper class, kings and priests, were the ones who sacrificed those bulls and oxen. So I don't know if the 7 pairs of birds is for sacrifice. Does it make a sacrifice non-sacrificial, sacrificial back and forth? I don't honestly know if that's the point. It's definitely 717 that's mentioned here. But the reason that these animals are bracketed off separately and mentioned here is because of the sacrificing. Here, they're mentioned as the very last thing before getting into the ark, because the story is going to be structured so that sacrificing these animals is the first thing that Noah does when he comes out of the ark. So he says, get all the animals onto the ark and stuff. The unclean, the clean for sacrifices, the unclean, and the birds. And I see no reason why the birds are not sacrificial. They're not explicitly called clean that I'm aware of. So, but that's the point. They're mentioned last because of what happens as soon as he gets off the ark. So the story is unfolding in a specific format. And then verse 4 says, 7 days from now I'm going to send the floodwaters. The question that we could ask but not get an answer to is, did it take 7 days to load all the animals up? Is he saying, start getting on the ark? Because you could translate that, start getting everything on the ark, because 7 days from now I'm going to flood everything. Or are humans and animals getting on board on day 1 and then they're sitting there waiting for 7 days? Either option is perfectly interpretable. This is usually the ones that most people go with, the second one. They got on board and they just kind of sat there for a week. Either way, why would God start 7 days out? If it's not for the practical purpose of saying it's going to take you 7 days to get all these things loaded up and everything on board, what would the point be? Literally, if we think in terms of Genesis 1, which we talked a little bit about last week, 7 days is one creation cycle starting in Genesis 1. We're counting to 7 again. It's as if God is saying, okay, be ready. One more creation cycle, one more week, one more 7-day count, and then I'm going to undo all of the creation. Everything that we have read in Genesis 1 about God making the earth like a temple across 7 days is being highlighted here to say, okay, one more creation cycle and then creation will come to an end. So, be ready. Be prepared. You've been doing this building project for a century, who knows how long. Fair warning, you got 7 days left, one creation cycle left. And I think that would be the final countdown, God saying, this is it. It's about to happen, finally. Everything's ready. Let's do this. And it's as much an act of faith as building the ark itself. To believe that God is going to actually undo creation, uncreate things by flooding it with the waters that He pulled back at the beginning, that He tamed in Genesis 1, and saying, okay, in one creation cycle, this creation is going to come to an end. All the flood waters are going to come. That's a huge act of faith. Now get on the ark and show faith. Get on the ark and trust me. And so even before the flood waters come, God's presence is with the people in the ark before judgment. This is unfolding in such a way where this remnant theology that we've mentioned before is unfolding, where God says, my presence, my protective sphere of influence is with you on the ark. So get on the ark. I'm going to be with you in the ark. I'm not going to be with you if you're not on the ark. That's where everybody else is going to die. Get on the ark and let my presence be with you. If you're a Hebrew and you're tracking on this, where does God's presence reside? Just in general, where are they tracking God's presence to be? Geographically. An actual place. What? Not anymore in Eden. You're a Hebrew. Where's God? In the sky, yes. But in relation to you and how you approach God, where is God? Temple. He's in the temple. Before the temple, He's in the tabernacle. And God's presence comes down and rests there. And the Ark of the Covenant, another ark, another box, is where God's presence is physically available for Israel, to Israel. A physical representation of it. Even before the Ark of the Covenant, somebody's reading this story in ancient Israel should be reading this and thinking it's no different than the ark that we carry around, that we have in our temple. God's presence is with His people there, protecting them and seeing them through cosmic judgment. Do you have a question? Right. I've mentioned before that the Genesis prologue, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, as we have them, cannot be written any earlier than the exile. There are clear signs that they are using all sorts of loan words and stuff that come from Babylon, that come from Assyria, that come from the time of the exile and from slightly after. So it's really hard to date. But you can't really date the prologue any earlier than the exile. Once you get to Genesis 12, the Hebrew gets actually older, and it shows signs that it actually was written before the prologue. They're putting the prologue together as a clear literary unit to introduce what Genesis 12 is going to start with Abraham and build towards the nation of Israel. So they've already got things like the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, and the temple's Edenic imagery in their head when they're writing the official stories of God creating across 7 days the world like a temple. They're deliberately drawing out these pictures. Here I'm saying they're writing this story in such a way where when you're thinking of the Ark of Noah, they want you to also think of the Ark in the temple, where God's presence is, where God's manifesting Himself and making Himself available, is as much here to Noah, his family, and these animals as a remnant, as Israel and the temple. And that would mean something to you if in exile your temple had been destroyed and the Ark of the Covenant is we don't know where. because Babylon just up and destroyed the temple like 20 years ago. And you're like, well, where do we find hope? And you're living through this judgment, and these stories are being compiled and written down and collated into this book that's going to start being read every Saturday in Sabbath and stuff. You want the hope that God's presence is available to you. They're telecasting that in how they're telling the story. God's presence is with His people on the ark for 7 days before judgment even comes. God is with His people. And once again, it tells us Noah did all that Yahweh commanded him. So it's very emphatic to repeat this phrase all over again. So let's just take a step back and talk about the overall structure of the passage. 6, 9, and 10, it details Noah's election as Savior. Noah found favor in the eyes of God. He's the only righteous man of this generation. He's the only one good enough, concerned enough with God that God will actually spare him the coming judgment. So, God chooses him, and then God tells us details on God's choice to destroy. And then, 13 through 21, it's God's first instructions to Noah, and then Noah is faithful in response to God. And then it's God's second instructions to Noah about the clean animals, the unclean animals, and the birds. And then, once again, we get Noah's response of faithfulness to God. So it's Hebrew parallelism in the structure. And it tells us the emphasis of the structure and how the structure and story is playing out, so that we can see it, understanding themes and motifs, and discern the author's point. Be faithful to God in the midst of judgment. Be faithful to God, and you will find His presence with you in the midst of the circumstances that you're going to have to face. Here, these circumstances is the cosmic waters of creation are going to fall and destroy everything. So I want to get us started with this tonight, because we still have 20 good minutes here. And I want to understand the next portion, 7:6 through 8:14, in the ancient Hebrew mindsets. I want to talk about issues of interpretation and how they're tracking this story and why we started with cosmology a couple of weeks ago. But first, let's watch some Star Wars.
For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. Before the dark times. Before the Empire.
How did my father die?
A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil, helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He betrayed and murdered your father. Now the Jedi are all but extinct. Vader was seduced by the dark side of the Force.
I can't do it, R2. I can't go on alone.
Yoda will always be with you.
Obi-Wan. Why didn't you tell me? You told me Vader betrayed and murdered my father.
Your father was seduced by the dark side of the Force. He ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, the good man who was your father was destroyed. So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
A certain point of view?
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view.
Okay, that's the important part. Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths that we cling to depend greatly upon our own point of view. Because when you're reading the flood narratives, when you're reading the Bible as a whole, it's written from a particular point of view. And the whole point of going through this ancient cosmology stuff with how they understood a flat earth with the underworld and the great deep around it, and all of it existing inside of a big dome with God and living above the firmament and stuff, is because God didn't bother correcting their point of view. This is their point of view. When I was a kid, my grandparents had all 3 Star Wars on VHS. Every year we would go to camp around August and September at Tyler State Park. And my grandparents had a fifth wheel, and they had a 9-inch TV with a built-in VCR. And I would watch all 3 Star Wars over and over and over again all weekend long that we were at Tyler State Park. And even as a kid, I really hated what Obi-Wan said in Return of the Jedi, that second part of the clip. What I told you was true from a certain point of view. And even as a kid, I'm like 6, 7 years old, I'm thinking, well, that's just lazy writing. Because, unlike most kids, I actually thought about that stuff at the time. But the older I get, the more I understand Obi-Wan and why he didn't tell Luke when Luke asked the question. Now, I tend to think that when a kid is old enough to ask a question, he's generally old enough to hear the answer. But hey, how do you tell somebody that their dad is a mass murderer, including of young children? You know, you never want to be able to tell him that. And so he finds a way to tell him the truth without coming out and telling him the literal reality and letting him learn it on its own, right? And what he says from a certain point of view is true, and more importantly, he is right when he says many of the truths that we cling to depend greatly upon our own perspective. And so I want to talk about the flood story's perspective here with the last few minutes. First off, I want to note, as we move into the end of chapter 7 and chapter 8, that there is a chiastic structure to the flood story that I've marked out here, not just verse-wise, but also with color coding. Rainbow color coding, because it's the Noahic flood, and the symbol is the rainbow. So, A, B, C, D, E, D prime, C prime, B prime, A prime here. So, it starts in 7:4. 7 days for waiting for the flood is first mentioned. B, 7 days of waiting for the flood is mentioned a second time. C, 40 days of actual flood water are going to be mentioned. D, 150 days of chaotic waters triumphing over creation in 7:24. And then the core turning point of the story, but God remembered Noah. And then it's 150 days of the chaotic waters of creation receding. And then 40 more days of waiting, and then 7 more days of waiting, and then 7 more days of waiting. It's a balanced chiasm in the storytelling. So as we're moving through, why does it mention this? Why does it mention that? A Hebrew in the ancient world would have picked up on this, no problem. But the emphatic point is God remembers Noah in that ark. And that's when things start actually moving back towards life again. Everything here is moving towards protective status, and then the end of creation. And then when God remembers Noah, everything moves back towards life again, and God's protection moving through the deconstruction of creation. So let's read the passage, and we'll see how much we can get through after this. Starting in 7:6, this passage says, Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came on the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark as God had commanded Noah. After the 7 days, the flood waters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 7th day of the 2nd month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth. Wait, great deep? What are we thinking here? Springs of the great deep. This water down here. It's not even first and foremost mentioning water coming from the sky. This is water from below. This is how they're understanding it. On that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Now we're getting everything below and everything above. Water is coming in from both sides. And rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And when you think that, rain comes in a portal in the sky, and that God is basically leaving the door open in the portal and just pouring everything out, that's really the picture here when you understand the cosmology. On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wives and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kind, every creature that moved along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. So there it's just balancing the story out. It's repeating what it's already told you. Pairs of all the creatures that have the breath of life in them. This Genesis 1 language here, because this is God uncreating. So everything with the breath of life came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female, and every living thing as God had commanded. Then the Lord shut him in. They were supposed to make a door on the end of the ark. Noah did everything as God commanded. Now everything's on the ark. The floodwaters have come. And God's presence with them on the ark is in there protecting them. So what's on the outside? Water from below, from above, and it can't get in the ark where God's protective presence has shut these people and these creatures with the breath of life in them inside for protection. For 40 days, the floods kept coming on the earth, and the waters increased and lifted the ark high above the land. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the waters. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains and under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on the land perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing in the face of the land was wiped out. People and animals and creatures that moved along the ground and the birds were wiped from the land. Only Noah was left with those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Let me just point this out while I've got it up here. This idea of sending a wind and the waters receded, this is very much Exodus language as well. Because all night long, God sent the east wind, I think, to split the Red Sea. And then when he stops blowing the wind after they've crossed and stuff, the wind stops blowing and it drowns the Egyptians in a flood. So you should be able to catch these motifs and realize every time water is being mentioned, you're passing from death to life. Because what is baptism? What does it symbolize? A passage from death to life. Over and over and over again. All of it stems back to these stories that we don't necessarily tie to it. Okay, a couple more verses. I say a couple. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the land. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. We're going to skip the rest of this for time's sake tonight, and let's just hit a couple of quick things, because we'll come back to post-flood stuff later. So the flood comes, and the faithful remnant remains safe. 4 times it is expressed that Noah was obedient to God, and he did everything that God commanded him, which is pretty astonishing considering that saying it 3 times is as emphatic as something can get in Hebrew. For the story to say 4 times is something entirely beyond emphasis. And it's at the 4th mention of his obedience that the Lord shut him in. So this is the point. Noah, and by extension his family, survived because he was obedient and did everything that God commanded him. He's not safe from judgment, he's safe through judgment. And this is different because this notion of God doesn't judge his people is just plain false. That's the main people that God actually judges. That God doesn't judge Christians. That you're not going to have to answer for your sins before God. Of course you're going to have to answer for your sins before God. So you're not safe from being judged. You want to learn what it is to trust Christ through judgment, including your own, including the judgment on your society, including maybe even the judgment on your own church. It's all possible. So you're not safe from the effects of judgment, but safety to be preserved through the effects of judgment. And this, too, is what we ought to be aiming for. You should not seek to get out of judgment. In fact, you can't. It's going to happen. And usually it's not just going to be an individual thing. And for a culture that's boiled sin and salvation down to just these individual decisions, and when we do talk about judgment, we do talk about it as an individual judgment. We forget all the community around us that is going to be judged as a community. And that the community is going to have to learn to walk together through pain, through judgment, through crisis, through adversity. And that if your goal is, well, I just don't want to be judged, or only God can judge me, so you can't judge me, leave me alone, leave me to my sin. It's like, yeah, well, you're ensuring that you're going to be judged with that attitude. But you should have the fear of the Lord in you that says, I have to be judged. How do I survive judgment? Where is God's mercy in judgment? That's the question, because it's always there if you can look for it. It's here with Noah and by extension of his family, because Noah was the one person in his entire generation that would actually do what God wanted, as is mentioned 4 times, which is why God remembers Noah. This is a common Hebraic phrasing for God just being faithful towards his people in the midst of his most brutal judgments. This phrase will come up. God remembered so-and-so. God remembered something. And then in verse 2, the waters above and below stop. So the cosmic chaos has reached its height in verse 2. And now, under God's direction, it's going to begin to withdraw. He's going to pull it back like he does in chapter 1. And the human realm on land is going to be able to grow up again. So verse 3, the floodwaters begin to recede. So verses 1 through 3 are a turning point in the story as a unit from judgment to recreation. Now, verse 4 does not need to be translated as the ark is resting on the mountains of Ararat, but perhaps the mountains against the mountains of Ararat. I want to stop here, and I just want to go back to this picture and explain some things. We talked about a couple of weeks ago with the cosmic geography that they thought the firmament actually sat on these mountains, that the mountains reached the heavens because the heavens, the lowest part of the heavens, was the bottom of the firmament, that they sat on the mountains. That there was things that they thought of not just as mountains, but as cosmic mountains. The biggest mountains that they could imagine, the biggest mountain ranges that they could imagine, formed the border of this flat disk that they perceived of as the world. The mountain chain of Ararat in, I think it's what, North Turkey or something today? I don't remember. You could look it up on a map. Those were the northern cosmic mountain ranges. They are the furthest north that the Mediterranean ancient mind could conceive of. And so, when it says that the ark was lifted up by the waters and came to rest against the mountains, you don't necessarily need to think that it's spending the whole time up above those cosmic mountains. That when it finally, the waters recede and it comes to rest, it could actually be a lot lower than up there. You don't need to think so drastically. The point is, if you understand the chain of mountains of Ararat, it's both an individual mountain, the largest mountain, I think, of that mountain chain, but it's also the Mount Ararat is a chain of mountains in this area. What the author is really telling you is that they're now as far north as they could possibly get. No idea where they start, but they get as far north as in their minds they could possibly conceive of. And from there, in this mountain range, they're going to start coming out of the ark and being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth again. And now I'm going to end there tonight because it's not really that much different from God creating Eden in the mountains. I had mentioned this with Genesis 1. You should think of Eden in the mountains. One, all of these rivers running out of Eden and stuff tell you that it's probably in a mountain range. That when God creates and brings mankind to the garden, they're really quite high up in a mountain range. That would be the correct way to read Genesis 2. And when they're exiled, they end up coming off the mountains and start building cities and stuff until they come to Babylon in the east, and they're on the flatlands and the plains. So there's this dichotomy between it all, where the ancient imagination is being told God is starting over again with creation by sending the ark as far north as you can imagine to these cosmic mountains where God's Spirit in the ark with His people are starting over again. So you've got motifs of God's presence on a mountain with His people, recreating and starting over again. Because what is He going to do at Sinai in the building of the tabernacle? Meet with His people on a mountain, give Him laws and instructions, build the tabernacle, which is an Edenic imagery for where God is going to live. And then it all turns into a mountain in Jerusalem, carved out and turned into a temple, and over again. And until you get to Genesis 21 and 22, where the new heavens and the new earth are portrayed in the same temple-like structure over again. And it's just over and over and over again all throughout the Bible if you can pick up on it and track the pictures and the metaphors. And you have to get into the weeds a little bit because they're not spelling it out. This was much more obvious for these ancient people. So we'll pick it up with the post-flood stuff next week.